Good morning and welcome to Combined Grand Rounds for Psychiatry and Medicine. My name is Gary Desir, and this Grand Round is in collaboration with John Crystal, who could not be here today, but we've been in contact with him by phone, and he thinks this is a really important thing to do. So I'm just letting you know on his behalf. So this is the second combined medical grand rounds we've had. The last one was in 2017, and some of you may have been there, and it was given by Kimani Paul-Emile. She's a lawyer at Fordham University, and it was about how to deal with the racist patient. I believe it was well received, and we think that in an attempt to increase collaboration among departments, we plan to do this on a regular basis. So this is the second one. And this one is about underrepresented medicine, their journeys and narratives. So we think it's important to do this is a follow-up to the 100 Year of Women in Medicine, and we wanted to expand the conversation and focus on underrepresented medicine for this particular grand rounds. We just so that we're on the same page, I just want to share with you our definition of what URIM is, and at least for this particular talk. So underrepresented medicine means those racial and ethnic populations that are underrepresented in the medical profession relative to their numbers in the general population. And this is what we're going to be focusing on for these talks. So a few special thanks to people who have been really helpful in helping us set this up and organize it. So Roberta Bissiglia is the person in medicine who manages our grand rounds. Kim Blendman is sitting in the audience. She is the person who put this wonderful photo montage for us today. Tricia Dahl, who manages grand rounds for psychiatry. Christopher Gardner, who is the communication director for psychiatry. Jessica Isom and Natalie Lastra, who are the two chief residents for diversity and inclusion in psychiatry. Michelle Johnson, who will be making closing remarks for us. By the way, Michelle is the first African-American woman promoted to professor at Yale. And Darren Lattimore, who is the first Chief Diversity Officer for the medical school. I also wanted, yes, go ahead. I also wanted to thank two other people. One is Carolyn Mazur, who's in the audience, and Carolyn has been instrumental in helping a very important organization called MORE, which is a minority organization for retention and expansion, over the years in setting it up and making sure that it thrives and survives. And the other person is Rick Bibiscus. I don't know if Rick is in the audience, but Rick is I want to get his title correct. He's a professor of anthropology and ecology and evolutionary biology, and is the deputy provost for faculty development and diversity at Yale University. And this week, Rick was elected as a fellow to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, an honor bestowed upon him by fellow members. And there were 3 other faculty members at Yale who received this honor this week. So if you see Rick, please congratulate him. So now I'd like to introduce 2 faculty members who are what I consider agents of change. The first is Cindy Crusto, who is an associate professor in psychiatry, and the assistant chair for diversity in psychiatry. And the second is Inhinya Janau, who is an associate professor in medicine, an associate chief of diversity and inclusion for the Department of Medicine, and also plays the same role for graduate medical education in Steve Hewitt's office. So I'm going to ask them to come to the podium and tell you a few things, and then Darren will introduce our panelists, and then we'll come back. So Cindy? Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I want to send a special thank you to Gary. I want to send a special thank you to Gary and to John Crystal for being so supportive of this Grand Rounds and other things that we're doing that focus on diversity within our departments and the School of Medicine. We thought we would share a little bit of data from each of our departments just to set the context and the stage for why this Grand Rounds is important. I will share data from psychiatry, and Gary will share data from medicine later in his presentation. So this slide shows gender by academic rank in the Department of Psychiatry. And as you can see at the assistant and associate professor ranks, there are more women than men. On both tracks, there are 52% women and 48% of men. However, at the full professor rank, there are more than 2 times as many men as women, so 69% men compared to 31% women. And we do have women who are in the pipeline more recently in our department, but this just provides you a little bit of context as it relates to women in the department. This slide presents race and ethnicity data by academic rank for the Department of Psychiatry, and these 2 columns really tell the story. So for the full professor rank, 87% are Caucasian or white, 7% are Asian, and there are no other racial or ethnic minority groups represented at the full professor rank. The column on the far right-hand side of the slide just shows for all ranks what the data look like. So 76% of those on the latter track are white, followed by 11% who are Asian, 7% African American, 3% Hispanic or Latino, and other groups are not represented in our department. So we know that to address these gender and racial and ethnic disparities, we need to recruit and retain faculty and address the climate at Yale School of Medicine. And the Grand Rounds today is really to help raise awareness and understanding of the experiences and journeys of underrepresented individuals in medicine. We hope that we can improve the climate and the work environment, and this Grand Rounds, we think, will help our understanding of what those journeys and experiences are like. So I'm going to turn it over to Hininia.
So the data that Cindy shared, and also what Gary will do in a few minutes, is quite compelling for us to act. But there are some organizations already at Yale that are doing just that, and I want to share a little bit of information on them. And obviously, this is not an inclusive list. The first one is Diversity, Inclusion, Community Engagement, and Equity, otherwise called DICE. And DICE is focusing on 4 areas. One is diversity, basically looking at the pipelines and recruitment of trainees. Inclusion, looking at the climate and the retention of trainees, ensuring that the trainees that we recruit to Yale, that they proceed through the ranks so that they become residents at Yale, fellows or attendings, and so forth. And then the other area is community engagement, looking at programs led by the trainees in the community, and equity, looking at social justice issues. The next is the Minority House Staff Organization. This is for the Yale New Haven Hospital, and is led by 2 co-presidents, Rhea Roberts and Jessica Isom. It just turns out that they're both, one from medicine, one from psychiatry, just like the Grand Rounds today. And the MHO also focuses on recruitment, and one activity that they're organizing is the underrepresented, basically URM recruitment dinner on the 24th of January. And that dinner is across programs where we invite all URM applicants that have interviewed at any of our programs come back for that dinner. And this year is going to be our 2nd year. The next is the Office of LGBTQ Resources, and that is throughout the university. So in addition to the LGBTQ resources, that is an office, we also have affinity groups. Psychiatry also is leading as a group in LGBTQ, and the School of Medicine has committees and task forces already ongoing. The Status of Women in Medicine that was founded in 1979, also focusing on gender equality with looking at the climate, looking at the women leadership roles, as well as recruitment and retention of female faculty and the compensation equity. The next one is MORE, or Minority Organization for Retention and Expansion. MORE was founded in 2007 and is also looking at the recruitment and retention of minorities and focusing on the mentorship of junior faculty by the senior faculty and collaboration and outreach to minority students, residents, physicians, and fellows. So all these organizations have something in common. The theme is recruitment and retention. We know that increasing the retention of the retention rate of those of us here requires more effort, and that effort is linked to succeeding and achieving our goals, achieving our dreams at Yale. Two major departments have come together to lead one of the most historical and time-honored traditions, such as grand rounds. Today, we will have a diverse group of faculty from both departments that will share their personal and academic journeys at Yale. Our plan is to continue with combined grand rounds, and we're hoping that other departments also follow suit. At the individual level, our goal is that you learn from the journeys of this faculty and see them as resources for you. We also hope to see many of you participating as panelists in future grand rounds. And before we proceed to the panelists, I would like to go over the program for today. You most likely picked up two pieces of paper. One is the bio on the panelist, and the other one is the program. In a few minutes, Darren Lattimore will introduce the panelist, and it will be a brief introduction because you have the bios with you. But before I introduce Darren Lattimore, I would like to go over the program. So around this time, 10:30, Dr. Lattimore will introduce the panelists. The panelists will have, each of them will have 8 minutes to go over the questions, and Darren Lattimore will be watching the time, so you two, you four there, pay attention. And after the panelists are done, there will be a Q&A, and there are different ways of asking your questions, and you'll hear all the details of that in a few minutes. At 11:30, Dr. Desir will come back to the podium, and he will present the role of the department chair in URM faculty advancement. After Dr. Desir is done, we're going to have another period of Q&A, and then we'll be having closing remarks by Michelle Johnson. This is a change in the program, and Dr. Johnson is a professor of radiology and biomedical imaging and of neurosurgery, and she's also the director for interventional neuroradiology. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Darren Lattimore, that I think it was already introduced. But Dr. Lattimore is the Deputy Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at Yale School of Medicine. And we have this for you since you're walking around.
So before we begin introducing the panelists, I would like to actually introduce two of the psychiatry chief resident extraordinaires who are actually going to help me with the process. So can Doctors Isom and Latrasha come on up, please? And while they're coming up, I just want to acknowledge Dr. Microaggressions, who has actually arrived. We, in your absentee, thanked you for all that you've done and congratulated you on your recent honor.
Good morning. Sorry. So I am Jessica Isom, and this is Natalie Lostra. And we wanted to first give you a brief description of our position. So the Chief Residents of Diversity and Inclusion, it was a position that was created a couple of years ago. We're the second pair of Chief Residents. And it was created to serve as a sounding board for residents who are concerned about issues related to diversity and inclusion. Also, we are meant to identify issues and sites that need to be addressed to improve diversity and inclusion within the Department of Psychiatry, and more specifically, the Psychiatry Residency Program. We are also responsible for creating programming to bring attention to issues of diversity and inclusion and to educate the department to improve its practices. And as an advocate, we are participating on the Graduate Education Committee in order to influence policy within the department. We are also responsible for facilitating Title IX reporting for residents that bring us their concerns.
And so for the next portion, we're actually just going to describe how questions can be submitted. There are 3 ways. There was a question that was actually submitted before grand rounds, but during, you can either come to the microphone. There are cards that were circulated where you can write your question, and if it's directed to a particular panelist, you can include that. And then there's also a link on that card that shows an electronic method of anonymous questions being submitted, which Jessica and I will be reviewing as we go through. Thank you.
So now I'd like to have our 4 panelists come up. Doctors Hewitt, Professor of Medicine, Associate Dean of GME, Dr. E. Cote Dobe, I'm sorry. Assistant Professor of Medicine, Section of Primary Care and Infectious Disease, Dr. Kapoor, Associate Professor in Psychiatry, Associate Program Director in Forestry, Dr. Marshall, Associate Professor in Department of Internal Medicine, and Dr. Santana, Assistant Professor, Department of Psychiatry. And so each of them were given 5 questions to actually oh, I thought they were gone. Where'd they go? Each of them were given 5 questions to actually think about in preparation for the conversation, and each of them will have approximately 8 minutes. I'm going to apologize in advance. I've told I've got to be a stickler to your 8 minutes. So if I start walking closer to you, that means wrap it up. So tell us about your journey in your department. What have been challenges? What have been opportunities? How has your personal life intersected with the work? What are some lessons that you've learned? And for us young folks, what are some advice that you would have for each of us? Want to start on this end?
So I'm going to share my story, which is about being a bit different in some way. Aren't we all different in some way? Where do you go to medical school? You walk as if you're dancing, and you dress like you're in Miami. I actually like that one. Rico Suave. I've been confused at times for being a sitter. These things never bothered me. Maybe those are not my tender points. Go back to Mexico, I'm sure they need you there more than we need you here. Didn't bother me until the Mexican patient next door stood up and they almost got into a fight. He stood up for both of us. Cinco veces, a psychiatrist from court who didn't speak English repeated many times in a hearing as if I did not understand in English the times that the patient has been hospitalized because of diabetes mellitus. It bothered me because that vulnerability that I had of not being American was used to commit involuntarily a young African-American woman when all what she needed was social assistance. I was born and raised in a town at the east of the Dominican Republic. Despite being part of the minority in this country, I was not back home. I didn't know much about inclusion and cultural humility until I got here at Yale. I started internal medicine program outside of Yale. Intern year is a foreign place for most trainees, regardless of where they're coming from. For me, though, I left my country, my food, my family, and my friends. The hospital sponsors your visa. They own you. I didn't know about the cold winters or its clothing. English was a second language. I had the words, and I was able to form sentences. I could not always effectively transmit the meaning or feelings genuinely. Jokes fell flat. Stealing phrases was thin, sounding fake, and at times insecure. Yale versus Yale. During these years, I thought I was catching up all the time, and that feeling has not completely disappeared. I struggle at times trying to differentiate myself in medicine. I remember getting an evaluation saying, "He's too quiet. I don't know what he's thinking." What I don't remember is being asked what I was thinking, or being provided the environment in which my thoughts would be safe. When I expressed myself, I was told, "Get a thick skin." I was too sensitive. You get confused, you know. I can't answer why this happened to me. Was it because of my nationality or my skin color, my sensibility, or my height, or my age? But what I can tell you is it's not about thick skin. I think our skin is thick enough, and we just have different tender points. And some of us have little wounds based on our experiences. Just because some of us have them more exposed doesn't mean that you can poke them constantly. Dr. Herbert Knight, thank you for your support and validation during my intern year. At the end of this year, I decided to want to be a psychiatrist. I wanted to be more like my mom. And I want to say, in the anonymity of her pharmacy, she gave birth control pills to poor women with many kids. And her clients asked her for advice about medications doctors have prescribed because she had their trust. More importantly, I have vivid memories of my tiny, brave mother putting huddled deck to psychotic patients in her pharmacy or in the backyard where they have been locked away for years, encouraging them to get out of them. And I saw them walking out and giving them very bizarre gifts like car magazines or video game discs, and she would save them with a lot of appreciation. Despite this big interest in psychiatry that I had, people told me that was not a good fit because of my English. My old program at some point said I wasn't like them, referring to other residents at Yale Psychiatry. That was true. I appreciated the honest advice. However, for honest advice, I go to family and friends. For mentors and advisors, I also need those to be helpful. Interviewing at Yale. Thank you, Dr. Ross, for being curious about my experience and flexible in understanding them. I think I shared that my psychiatry instructor killed herself and I didn't have a good experience in psych at home. That didn't stop your interest in learning how I could be a good addition to your program. Dr. Robert Warba, when you said your application is good, but the most important thing, it is not in your CV, I freaked out for a second. Then you added, I'm referring to what my residents have said about you. Being a non-traditional candidate, there are so many things that don't fit in your CV. When we leave our country, there's so many things we leave behind, but there are so many things that come with us. The experiences at the hospitals, for instance. This woman, after a tough delivery, had a severe bleeding, and she needed to be taken to the OR on the second floor. The elevator was broken, and I had to take her on a wheelchair through the stairs. The resident and I were soaked in her blood when we got to the second floor. Blood that she needed to leave. She died. Being at Yale, I have received the same treatment that others got, no more, no less. I never wanted any special treatment, but I do have some special needs. Visa, for instance. If we were all the same, we would have the same needs. It would be easier, but I'm not gonna apologize for that. Interviewing for a faculty position. You need to learn how to interview for an academic position, Theo, I was told during the interview. Where do you see yourself in 10 years? Well, if you don't sponsor my visa, or you fail to justify that to the Department of Immigration that I'm exceptional, I have to go home. I kept going. Why do you want me here? I don't know. People like you. Kim Jong-un's like you. I like her, by the way. But what about you? I said. I like how comfortable you look in the medical floors. Even he didn't know where I was from. I felt he got me. That was definitely me. I like working, being available. I grew up holding the hand of a broken arm in a trauma practice that my father had in the same place where we lived. Once an attendant told me, you don't need to work that much. We know you're great. But I needed to be dependable, exceptional. Remember the visa? I may have delayed academic projects to show that I was thankful for the opportunity to be here. Ayana Jordan, you're not only my friend, but you're my earliest mentor. You're a powerful soul, a sparkling energy, and you told me Yale is great, but they're not out there doing good deeds when they're hiring people. I am an excellent clinician, a badass efficient psychiatrist, and a unique teacher. I enjoy developing teaching workshops and writing about interface medicine and psychiatry. Chris Diana, thanks for being an American family. Paul Desan, you're not aware of your contribution. You once told me that your excellent consultant skills, talking about yours, were because of your white beard. You didn't mention being a tall white male. And by the way, his beard is not only a beard, it's Sigmund Freud's beard. I understood that the absence of some features would need my extra effort, but you always treated me as if I didn't need them, and any of the extra effort. So I'm finishing soon. I just want to finish with this. One morning, I chose to see a Hispanic patient before rounds, and a hospital staff asked me to step out of the patient's room, grab my ID, and reported me to the floor manager because I didn't look like I knew what I was doing. The person thought I was a family of another Hispanic patient. The act was unintentional but insensitive attempt to injure my confidence in one of the most important tasks in my job, patient care. So many of these experiences did not involve a white American male, and I have not been the exception. Once I interrupted female APRNs in rounds, my first reaction was an intense urge to deny it and say, nurses, we doctors, we interrupt each other all the time. But thick skin, no, I didn't say that. We all have different experiences, and we have different tender points. One of the biggest challenges for me is to avoid getting cynic. But inclusion and equality are skills to learn for many of us, and I am grateful that Yale is the place where events like this take place.
Thank you very much.
So what I won't do is go into the great many details about who I am, but what I will say is that the theme in my life has been varying in diversity in terms of background and where I came from. So I was the son of Caribbean parents who immigrated to Canada in the 1960s to go to university. And I'm not an islander in the sense that I wasn't born on an island, but Montreal actually is an island, and that's where I was born. A lot of people don't know that. And I, like my colleague here, actually faced visa issues. But they were slightly different. I went to undergrad here at this university. Started in 1987, and up until that point, I hadn't spent a lot of time in the United States, and I actually had never seen Connecticut before my mother and I drove down from Ottawa, Canada, to go. And up until that point, I had been one of 2, 3, 4, 5 people of African descent throughout my life in Canada. And I was used to being one of the few. But that sort of plays with your psyche a little bit, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But Yale undergrad was interesting. One of the challenges that I faced was the same challenge that many people of African descent face, and that is that you don't belong, and at some point you've got to prove yourself. And back then it was the backlash against affirmative action. And it's funny, a lot of things I'm going to be talking about happen today. The assumption was that I was athletic, I was here because of my grades, or I was not there because of my grades or the sort of other things that I was bringing to the university. And so I was constantly having to prove myself, whether it was choosing a major that didn't have to be as difficult as it did, doing assignments, doing extra work, putting in extra time. And that sort of plays with you because, again, you're always sort of having to prove yourself. But it worked out, and I went on to medical school at the University of Connecticut and actually came back from my residency here at Yale. And what I found was that once again, I was one of 2, 3, or 4, 5 residents of color in a large internal medicine class. And once again, those questions arose again. You're here because of affirmative action, you're here to sort of make up numbers, et cetera, and you find yourself proving yourself again. And so you work hard, but that can weigh on somebody, especially when you're working long hours. And so you start to sort of question yourself. And it's really important to have that family background and that support from your family, but also your peers. And those peers were underrepresented minorities as well as what I would call mainstream. And that's another theme that I found is I've been able to find support in very interesting places and very solid places here at the university while facing these challenges. After my residency, for visa reasons, I knew that green card holders or people without green cards had a lot of problem advancing through training in the United States, and my impression is that's only getting more difficult. And so I decided to try to get my green card while I was at the Hospital St. Raphael's. So I left residency and I went to the Hospital St. Raphael's, and this is before the merger, and St. Raphael's was considered an underserved area. And that was a great experience for me because I was exposed to another residency program, while geographically close, was made up of people from all around the world. It's a wonderful place to be and to train residents from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Ghana. And it was wonderful sort of being around those young people from those varied backgrounds and sort of being presented with all of that diversity. That's also a place where I also met Dr. Herbert Knight, who actually is also a pulmonologist, as I am. So 4 years at St. Raphael's, I got my green card, and I eventually actually did become a U.S. citizen. So I'm a dual citizen, and came back to Yale to do my fellowship. And by now, I'm sort of quote unquote in. I've been here for a long time. That need to prove myself, I was sort of granted things that other underrepresented minorities may not be granted because I was part of the group. You were an undergrad, you were a resident, now you're a fellow. And so that proving of myself at that point was not as vital. But what I did start to do was, now that I wasn't sort of so focused on proving myself, I could sort of observe what was going on around me. And some of the other challenges that I faced was watching my fellow caregivers maybe not treat people the way I would treat them or the way that they wanted to be treated. And the question is, when you're a big group during rounds and someone is saying something like that about a patient for the wrong reasons, using phrases like these people, and they're not referring to diabetics, etc., how do you deal with that? And by this time as a fellow, I was probably a little more mature than my other fellows, and started to speak out when these things happened, and stop it at the path, or just stop it where it was. And I felt empowered because I had already proven myself. I'd already been here a long time, and so I felt empowered to do that. And I don't know that everybody feels that way. And so, as a segue, what I would say is that people who do feel empowered, make sure that you empower others. Make sure you sort of instill that in others and let them say, go ahead and speak out. Go ahead and say what you need to say. I think that one of the barriers for me has been is I'm not a complainer. But I think there's a time to know when it's important to be heard, and there's a time to know when it's important to be patient. And so I think sort of as a fellow, I started to get through these things, and I think taking the MPH and understanding sort of healthcare policy and healthcare at the macro level really helped understand disparities in healthcare at a pretty early stage in my career as well. I went away to join private practice in Pennsylvania for 2.5 years and came back on faculty in 2008. And one of the things that I've learned as a faculty member is mentorship. Listen to your mentors. Sometimes that's something I'm not great at. Trust your mentors, but also trust yourself. In other words, if things aren't working out, trust yourself to choose or select another mentor. But also, if that's the mentor you've chosen, trust that person and have more than one. Different perspectives. And please understand, your mentor doesn't have to be a mirror of you. In order to sort of grow, it's best to have diverse mentors and be exposed to diverse opinions. And I think I'll end there because Dr. Lattimore is
getting closer. Thank you very much.
First of all, I just want to thank the organizers of this panel for including me, because as a South Asian woman, I actually don't take for granted that I belong at this table of underrepresented minorities. And I say that because by the time I was a psychiatry resident 15 years ago, women already outnumbered men in psychiatry training programs. And South Asians, like Indian people in medicine, were not exactly an endangered species, where there are lots of us where, in fact, we're overrepresented compared with the general population. So I just want to start by saying I'm honored to be here and to be given an opportunity to tell my story, which is one in which I've had tremendous privilege, certainly, but also some significant professional challenges related to my identity. So I'll tell you just the bare bones of my mother and father both immigrated to the U.S. from India. My mother is Muslim, my father is Hindu. If you know anything about Indian culture, you know it's pretty rare for that to happen. And that I was, my siblings were born in the U.S. And raised in the suburbs of Chicago and then in rural Indiana. And so I came to Yale in 2007 to do my forensic fellowship, forensic psychiatry, and I thought, oh, I'm going to stay 1 year and then I'm going to go back to Boston where I'd done residency. And I didn't know anybody in Connecticut. I had no reason to be here other than the training. And I had this tremendous experience of basically like falling in intellectual love with Yale forensic psychiatry, you know. And I remember thinking like, I don't know how I found this group of amazing people who are both rigorous thinkers and compassionate souls. But this is something rare, and I better stick around for it. And I did. And at that point in my early career, kind of going from fellowship to faculty, I felt like I was really lucky. I was supported by mentors who also just sort of happened to be national leaders in our field. And it felt like at that point, like things happened pretty easily in my career. And yes, there was this sort of issue of not having mentors in forensic psychiatry who looked like me, but honestly, that wasn't something I expected, you know, and it didn't come to the forefront. And so I was sort of happily learning my craft with one caveat. And that was that I learned pretty early on in my professional life that you also, being a young woman in forensic psychiatry, came with what I called sort of navigating the minefield of old guy sexuality. And by that, I mean, like, nothing earth-shattering ever happened to me, but I can't count anymore how many times in professional settings that an older male colleague kind of sat too close, you know, lingered in a hug too long, called about something too late at night, you know, or I went to a conference and had conversations with people where I thought they were interested in my work, and I came home to find emails from them saying clearly, making it clear that it was not a professional interest that they had in me, and how sort of confusing that was. But I'm also going to say something that's probably heresy in 2018 in the era of Me Too, but like those things didn't break me, you know, they didn't have some sort of like lasting damage either on my career or on my psyche. And I wish I could say that was because I sort of became expert at handling them, like I had some perfect catchphrase I could share with you. But actually what happened, I mean, I think it's because I got older, and there's always kind of somebody younger to hit on. And I was more prominent in my field. And so instead, I just sort of like filed these incidents away, apparently for 10 years until we had a combined medicine grand rounds in psychiatry in which I could share them with you. And I think, you know, what's been interesting to me in my career is like those concerns, those early concerns about sexuality and have faded away with time. And what's become more prominent in recent years are the kind of structural barriers, unconscious bias, like those kind of problems have become much bigger and brought into more focus in my career. And part of that is because, I work with people with mental illness in the criminal justice system. And you can't really, you'd have to be comatose to know anything about our criminal justice system and not understand that there are racial and ethnic disparities in that system. And I think having that education has brought into more focus than what are the inequities kind of in our professional space as well. And I think it's been a sobering education, just to share with you a little bit. Forensic Psychiatry has had a professional organization for 49 years, and in that time there have been 5 women who were president, all of them white. And that there's been sort of 2 black men who have been president. There's never been an Asian person in that role. That also our own Yale Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship began in 1979. It's been training women since 1982. And to my knowledge, in this department, not one had risen even to the rank of associate professor before me. And so I think I've kind of been left with this question of where did all the women go? Or it's brought into focus that the future, if you just look at the numbers, doesn't look particularly bright for me. That, Asian people, even though we're overrepresented in the workforce, we're underrepresented in leadership positions, and that's across all of medicine. So I will say that given those facts, this could be a pretty depressing talk. Most days I don't feel that way. I feel actually very fortunate at this stage of my career to be involved in a number of national, international leadership groups that are still primarily populated by older white men. But in my experience, they have been kind, open-minded, willing to listen to these issues of diversity when they're brought to them. And yes, I wish it weren't always my burden to do so, but I genuinely think that things are changing, that we're living through an important period of transition right now. And I'm also really encouraged by the generation of women and minorities that I see coming up behind me, how brave they are to call out problems when they see them and to not settle for less than what they deserve. So I think at this stage in my career, one of the most important things I can do is just be vigilant about speaking up when I am the one who's sort of the only person of color in a room of power and privilege, and also making a space kind of for the voices of those around me to be heard. So I thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you so much for the opportunity to share my experiences as a woman and a person of color in medicine. For me, what it's meant to be a Black woman in medicine is to constantly be aware of my identity and to have to navigate the negative stereotypes attributed to it, as well as to understand the need and importance of minority representation. So I'll start off by sharing a little bit about my background. I grew up in Nigeria. It's a country located in West Africa. It has about 190 million individuals, the majority of whom look like me. So although growing up, I had no concept of race or a racial identity, there were certainly other variables, such as ethnic, religious, and regional differences that created tension between certain groups. And as a result of these differences, there were historically rooted structural and systemic barriers that disproportionately affected some groups more than others. These barriers were interethnic and not interracial. However, when my parents, 4 siblings, and I immigrated to the US, I remember my parents sitting us down one evening. With somber faces, they looked each of us in the eye and issued this piece of advice. This advice is echoed throughout the years and sadly has held true in my experience. They said, "This is the land of opportunity, where anything you dream, you can become. However, in this country, as a result of the color of your skin and the legacy of discrimination, you will likely never be looked upon as a true equal to your white counterparts. Therefore, you must work twice as hard if you want to succeed. This was the first time that I took notice of the shedding of one identity for the assumption of another, and imbibing all the social implications of this new identity. So to discuss my journey as a Black female faculty member at Yale is to first acknowledge the importance of my identity. I have now lived in the US much longer than I have in Nigeria, and I no longer view myself entirely in the context of my heritage. To everyone here, without the shared knowledge of my upbringing, would have assumed me to simply be a Black woman, without the nuance of my cultural heritage. And in so labeling me with this identity, would have formed preconceived ideas about my values and beliefs. When I joined Yale, I did so as an ID fellow, and I was visibly the only Black woman in my division. And I remember the incredible amount of pressure I placed on myself to succeed. It was so incredibly important to me to try to have the best case presentations, to try to write the best ID consult notes, because it was so important for me to prove to leadership that no mistakes were made in recruiting me to this prestigious institution and division. I remember time and time again the amount of worry that would go into preparing for a case presentation to be delivered in front of my peers and faculty. I would usually start weeks and weeks in advance to ensure there were no hiccups on presentation day, only for the day to come and be able to pull off a good presentation, but not without enduring severe migraines and panic attacks before and after, sickened with worry, wondering if I did a good enough job, and wondering what everyone thought of me. I remember the comment from a well-meaning colleague, and similar comments from others, after he heard me deliver at Journal Club. Eyes enlarged, he approached me with a look of wonder and said, "Wow, that was great. You speak so well." The insinuation was clear to me then, and I wanted to offer him the perspective that English was my first language, so that was indeed to be expected. I remember the crippling self-doubt that would eat away at my self-confidence every time an opportunity arose to impart whatever knowledge I had amassed to my peers and division when called upon to do so through discussions of cases, fearing that English, my first language, would suddenly escape me and betray my feeling of ignorance. I remember the fear of making mistakes in front of my attendings, worried that my mistakes would be magnified and emphasized in a way that would be used to discredit me in some way. To this point, I remember making the mistake of sharing this fear with a colleague who was not an underrepresented minority and thus had a community of support around her, only to hear this individual shrug it off and say, "It's no big deal. I make mistakes too." How could I explain to her that her mistakes would be perceived differently to mine, that I felt I did not have room for error in the way she did? I remember wanting to fade away, be forgotten, be hidden, for fear that any shortcomings I felt I had would be discovered and would be the proof that I truly did not belong, and perhaps a mistake had been made. I spent a significant portion of my fellowship trying to prove to my peers or potential mentors that I was indeed smart or dedicated or committed, because somewhere along the way, the myth perpetuated was that members who shared in my social identity were the opposite of these things. And at the end of a long day of trying to prove my worth to everyone around me, I looked around me and saw the lack of a visible community of others who looked like me to share some of the burden of these experiences. Instead, I found isolation in being the singular representative of my demographic in both academic and social circles. This lack of representation, or the inability to see myself in my peers or leadership, translated to the inability to form vital connections that help foster career advancement and professional growth at a time when I felt it was important to do so. The impact that these experiences had on me included varying degrees of burnout, lack of a sense of belonging, isolation, frustration, and a persistent sense of anxiety. However, despite these challenges, there have been opportunities to overcome them and lessons learned. For me, it has meant coming to the realization that discrimination, prejudice, and bias towards certain groups are usually born out of fear. Fear of the unknown and a need to preserve a certain social order to the status quo. That fear feeds off of our differences and minimizes our similarities. That fear capitalizes on our separateness and not our togetherness. That fear can turn ethnic, racial, religious groups against one another without cause. And until we take steps towards diversifying our micro-communities, opening the door to varying ideas and opinions and experiences and backgrounds, prevailing parochial mindsets held by a select few will continue to marginalize the experiences of so many. To me, the solution is simple. There needs to be more opportunities for minorities to share their experiences and a willingness for the broader Yale School of Medicine community to acknowledge these shared experiences. There needs to be elaborate and well-constructed network of agents committed to furthering the goals of diversity and inclusion in every department and every division. And lastly, there needs to be active and engaged support, outreach, and mentorship offered in a structured and methodical way to ensure the success of all our underrepresented minorities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Steve Hewitt. I'm clinically in the Department of Medicine. I'm professor of medicine. A little bit of academic background. I was, for 24 years, the program director of our primary care residency and got to work for 9 years as vice chair for education. And I also had the opportunity to start the MedPeds program and was program director of that for 10. And I'm currently the associate dean and director for GME. So that's all the dry stuff. I want to thank the folks that I get to be up here with today, including our future president of the American Forensic Psychiatry Association. So you may be wondering, did he do a 23andMe test? And he's up here because of some interesting finding. The answer to that's no, and I'm not going to use that to run for president either. So I appreciate Cindy and Anhenia's openness to everyone who's on the panel here, and I'll just share a thought that I'm having at the moment. So I'm up here as a gay man, and whenever one speaks and you have to say who you are, that's not such an easy thing to do. And I realized that, and that's why it took me a little while, Anhenia, to give you a yes to be up here today, but I know you too well and couldn't say no. And I want to be sure that you hear that I'm speaking as myself. And I'm not here as a representative of a community. None of us are. We're all here speaking as ourselves. And each of us has our own lived experience, and that is unique, and that is diverse. And where we grew up and who we were with and what we've had the opportunity to experience since then continues to shape that. And I'm a different person today, and how I think about my identity and what that means in my personal life and my professional life than I was 10 and 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 years ago. I'll share a little on the personal side, and then I'll share a little bit about my own experiences here, and they've pretty much all been here on the professional side. So I grew up in New Hampshire with a beautiful, well-connected, large, very Catholic family. I have 6 siblings. My mother and father each had 7 siblings. They all had a lot of kids, and I have about 50 first cousins. On my mother's side of the family, there are 35, and we all lived within a 2-mile radius of each other, like kind of crazy. But we could literally walk to each other's homes. And I know all of them. The Christmas holiday is coming up, and I'll probably see about half of them at a gathering that we still hold every Christmas night. When I was a kid growing up, there was absolutely no one in my environment who I knew at the time to be gay. None. I can remember being a young kid and nightly news when the American Psychiatric Society made the brilliant declaration that being gay or lesbian was not a mental health disorder. And I remember the really uncomfortable conversation around that. And my parents never said anything negative about anybody. But that close social network that they were a part of, they would go to each other's homes on the weekends and they'd play cards. and they'd chat. And they would chat about whatever the topics of the news of the day were, including that one. I think I was in 7th grade. And there was nothing real positive that came out of that conversation. And that, along with other things, I think really led me to the conclusion that I felt like I had a broader understanding of people for some reason, but I didn't know why. I felt like it didn't matter to me if I was socially with boys or girls, but I didn't know why. And I wondered if it could be that I might be gay, but that wasn't even a word that I heard people saying out loud. And so I just made the assumption that that couldn't be. And I just lived for a period of time that just couldn't be. And when you're in an environment where it's not just anyone who you hear speaks like you or uses words that you use to self-identify, you also don't have role models around you. So I love my parents and my family, but there wasn't a relationship role model that I could see, that I could relate to in that kind of way either. I think when I began to gain confidence in who I was really to some degree in medical school. I went to Duke, and then to a larger degree when I came here. And I did my medicine residency and my nephrology fellowship training here. And I remember distinctly a patient. His first name is Rick. This was in the mid and late 80s. Rick was in the ICU with an extended intubation for pneumocystis pneumonia, which was sadly the way that a lot of people discovered that they were HIV positive. Equally sadly was the way a lot of people's families discovered that the person they loved was gay and they didn't know it. Equally sadly, a number of my colleagues who wouldn't shake the patient's hand, let alone go in the room sometimes. And while you might think that would cause me to run the other way, that actually was very empowering. And I found that if this person could be who he was, I could be who I was. And that was extremely helpful to me into coming back into balance in that part of my life. In terms of a few things on the professional side, I haven't had negative experiences being who I am in this department in any major, like, oh my God, that was an awful kind of thing. But there have been some challenges along the way. One of those is the fact that every time you have to tell someone who you are, that's like a part of the conversation every time that you don't want to have. And so it actually didn't come into a lot of my professional conversations because frankly I didn't want it to. And I didn't want to have to wonder what the other person might think and how that might change how they felt comfortable connecting with me or not, regardless of how comfortable I felt connecting with that person. So I left it out of my professional conversations for a long time. And then I started working with residents. And it's always been important to me to encourage people to be who you are, be authentic, and find the support for that. And I felt that I could no longer be the quiet person who was who I am. I needed to be the open person about who I am. And I was very intentional about that. And I think that's very important in my current leadership role, to be very upfront about who I am as well. And I will close before Darren gets too much closer. And I'll be glad to take questions. I think a closing comment that I wanted to make and just acknowledge that it's true for me, because I think it's true for many of the other folks in the same community that I share, is that two things. One is the word family in my community means anyone else who's a member of the LGBT community. And that comes from the fact that oftentimes our family was not our biological family. And I'm grateful for that family community. And the second thing that I wanted to say is that for myself and for most people, it's kind of those subtle negative comments that folks make over time that even though they don't bother you in the moment, they accumulate, and they mostly affect things like your confidence. And that can be one of the reasons that people don't step forward and ask for opportunities. Thanks for listening.
Begin by thanking each of you for your willingness to be vulnerable and your authenticity. I know in many cases it's not easy. My colleagues will come back up. So again, we have a couple different ways you can ask questions. index cards if you want to be anonymous, and I'll read them for you. If you want to come and ask a question yourself, I'll bring you the microphone. Or you can be highchatbridge.com, which will orchestrate and submit online. While we're getting organized, I do have a question for the group. All of you, in some way or another, talked about microaggressions. And many of you talked about the class specifically of assumption of inferiority. Help me understand how you were able to continue your resilience, quite frankly, in the face of those microaggressions, instead of at some point saying, I'm tired of this, and finding new green pastures.
So I think for me, I think I mentioned family and having that family that I could talk to in a great relationship, different mother, father, sister, cousins, a large extended family with a lot of people who had achieved a lot. Some of the pressure from my achievement comes from them. And so being able to rely on them and bounce these things off of them and sort of, how do you deal with this, or how should I deal with this? And one of the other things I didn't do for the sake of time was mention the fact that while I spent most of my life as a minority, I did live in Trinidad as a boy for 2 years. And it was kind of weird. It was like, wow, there's other people of color and then the majority and they're running the place and the place works. And so those couple of years gave me some confidence that, people of color sort of could do their thing, could run things. And sort of, I always sort of had to hearken back to that to sort of give me strength to go forward. And then eventually I just developed this tough skin, and now I just, I blow it off. But I don't know that everybody else has that, and that's why it's so important to empower others.
Well, personally, I allow myself to experience the difficult time, and I don't go back to myself to question the thickness of my skin anymore. I think I find support in my department, and I can go back to mentors and people, whether they look like me or not, but that they're willing to listen. So I think that's important, to have somebody in your department to support you.
And just for me, I think I agree. I think having a strong family support, a group of people that know you to fall back on, but also within the division in my department, there have been allies, individuals who have taken it upon themselves to understand what the experiences are for underrepresented minorities, and those individuals have served as a source of support as well.
So our next question, specifically for Dr. Peter Marshall, but also for the panel at large, why did you keep coming back to Yale if they treated you like an outsider? And more generally, why do you stay?
Why does anybody come to Yale? I shouldn't answer a question with a question, I'm sorry. But, when you have an opportunity to attend one of the premier institutions in the world, you take that opportunity. In terms of why do I keep coming back, I think I alluded to the fact that there were people that I met here that counterbalanced or opposed those negative experiences. Some of them are actually in this room right now. And if you're an optimist, you sort of see the glass half full. And so for me, there is more good here than not good. And it's in some ways become my home. There are other personal reasons why I've stayed in Connecticut and stayed at Yale that have sort of influenced that as well. But I think the main thing is the fact that I think that there's more good here than not. And I think if you find those individuals who are supportive, that you can get through.
We have a question from the audience. You are the victim of microaggression or discrimination flat out. A non-minority speaks up on your behalf. Is that welcomed, or does that feel maternalistic in your view?
I've been in a couple of those. Boy, it really depends. So if, and I'd appreciate someone else here to give an answer to this too, but if I'm obviously feeling unempowered, please step in. If I'm trying to say something, please give me a shot and then support me. So I think I would say that.
Looks like we have a question for the audience.
Okay, perfect. Thank you guys for being here. A lot of you mentioned family, but do any of you have children? And can you speak to what it's like to balance having a family and being so amazing?
So I've already aged myself. So balance between family life and professional life has been a particularly challenge for me, and for those of you who've known me for a long time, I'm on marriage number 2. I have a daughter and 2 stepdaughters, and they're all doing well, and they say they love me. I believe them. I have a good relationship with them. The youngest is a freshman or a first-year student at the University of Toronto, and the bottom line is, in an intense profession, it can be very difficult to balance family and your career. But what I would say is that it's really oftentimes it's the family that helps you get through the dangers or the pitfalls in your career. So it's something you don't want to allow to slide or to become neglected.
So my kids are out of the house, so it's like way easier right now. But I'll share, I think, a life lesson that I learned from my 2 sons that was very powerful for me. And it's not just, it is that kids are more resilient than we give them credit for, and they're more insightful and amazing than parents tend to give them credit for. I have a very good relationship with my son's mom. My 2 boys, one's an attorney, one's an occupational therapist. And when I was at the point where I was coming out to them, they were like 14 and 16 at the time. And their mom and I had figured life out about 8 years earlier than that. And that was the best conversation, honestly, that I've ever had with 2 young people because of their maturity and the way that they understood life way better than I did. They were both in our wedding when Mark and I got married. And they went with us with a lot of the things that we did to get ready for that, including the challenging experiences of, I mean, this is like silly shit that's really true. Having a baker refuse to make a cake, having a restaurant refuse to host our reception. So in Connecticut, not that long ago.
For the next question, I don't like the word microaggressions because I don't think they are micro. I think when taken together, and they accumulate and become macro. What are your thoughts?
While the panel is thinking about that, so whoever asked the question, I think is actually a very intriguing one because you're actually thinking about it from 2 different perspectives. As the target, I agree with you. The microaggressions actually are cumulative, and that is why they have such negative impacts over time. Unfortunately, the perpetrator only thinks in terms of the one whatever they just did. And so they're not cumulative from the perpetrator's perspective. But I agree with you. As a target, the reason why call them macroaggressions are so detrimental is they definitely are cumulative in their effect on you. Anything you guys want to add?
And I would just add it's called micro because it happens at an interpersonal level.
My question, and one of our panelists actually sort of spoke to this, is leadership. Yes, maybe you can do your day-to-day job, but for those of us who have aspirations of truly being the leaders of Yale University, where do you look for mentorship? Is there a glass ceiling, or is that really a possibility?
Yes, I think that there is a glass ceiling, but I think, like most things, it's more complicated than that. again, I look at some of the people in this room and I see where they have, what they have achieved. The fact that they have achieved it means I view myself sort of in the middling in terms of the hierarchy. I do know it can be done, and maybe some of them will share some of their experiences sort of getting to those higher levels. I also look at some of the hospital leadership, and I see that at the hospital leadership, there are people who would previously be called underrepresented at the hospital leadership, so I believe it's there, and I think they can share their stories, but for me, when I see that, I know that those things are achievable.
I think one of the hardest questions for me internally when you're looking at leadership positions or you've applied for something that you didn't get is like that internal dialogue of like, is this bias or do I just suck? You know, like, and you never really know in any situation. And I think because we're scientists, like, I like data, you know, and I think looking at trends over time and sort of analyzing patterns, and like Peter said, it's a lot more complicated. You know, there's pipeline issues. It's not always like bias is the only operative principle. But I think that's sort of like where I fall back on is kind of looking at data, looking at trends, and also falling back on like a healthy sense of narcissism. You know, someone's going to be the first, why not me?
What advice do you give to a minority who is thinking to apply to Yale? I think this question is partially speaking to how transparent are you about your experiences?
All they think. So I help recruit for the Department of Medicine. I make it a point of mentioning my husband when we're doing our introductions because I think it's important for candidates who may be sitting there to know that there's someone here who can say that out loud and that it's a safe place to do that.
I understand that outside of Yale, that Yale has a reputation of not being friendly towards minorities, and I think the only way that that reputation is going to change is if people come here and have positive experiences, regardless of whether they end up actually coming here. And so my advice to them would be yourself, apply, arrive with an open mind, and once again, our responsibility is to show good faith, be transparent, and be welcoming.
So I'll say that, you know, by staying true to themselves and knowing that they have perspectives that are valuable here, there's a lot that we bring in. Sometimes we don't have the confidence because we don't have similar experiences. And as I said, there are things you can't put in your CV because it's not, the CV is not tailored to experiences you've had abroad. So, but I think I found here that people are flexible. They're interested in our perspectives, and I found my voice, and I found confidence here. And I think it is because of conversations like this.
I just want to sort of put out there, I think, a somewhat different question. As an older person, I've struggled with the concept of diversity and inclusion for a long time. And I think I come at it from a particular sensitivity. When I think about underrepresented minorities in this country, my background is African American, poor, and Hispanic. And so I think about poor black people in this country. I think about Mexican Americans. I think about other Hispanic Americans as being the underrepresented minorities of this country. Now, I understand that Yale's view of minorities in this country, or it may be a view of minorities in the world present on the campus. But I can't help but to think about sort of from my perspective, historical target groups as underrepresented minorities. And I look at the panel there, all of whom I have great respect for and have appreciated all of their comments. But I note that, from my perspective, those underrepresented groups are not at all present. And in fact, if you look at some of the faculty, as already been mentioned, some people are overrepresented minorities. So this challenges me very greatly to sort of make this relevant and wonder where we're going with this. Thank you.
So what the gentleman is alluding to is we used underrepresented medicine as our definition. And he's asking us, are we stepping away from the federal original definition of underrepresented minority? African American Black, Latino meaning Mexican, Puerto Rican, Native American, Native Alaskan, other indigenous folks. And the reason why the federal government came up with that original definition of underrepresented minority is because those are the people that our government clearly had done things to disadvantage in our country. So I think the real question, sir, is how do you become more inclusive while not leaving behind the people that were originally harmed and continue to be harmed to this day? And I believe that that is actually a very good question, because if one, well, your observation, I don't know if the data is true, supports you or not, but your suggestion is we, at the cost of broadening the definition of diversity, may or may not have left actually the original people harmed behind. I don't know the answer to your question, but I do think it's a very valid question and one worthy of actually discussing. Thank you. Oh. Our 15 minutes are up is what I'm being told. Oh, one more? One last one? Okay, one last one.
Do you hear me? Okay. I'm Paul. I'm a neurology resident. I'm Ecuadorian. Before neurology, I completed medicine. I'm an IMG. I completed medical school in Ecuador. The training here has been amazing so far, but sometimes I've heard comments alluding like IMGs are not as good as American graduates. And, initially I don't care. I have 3 years of medicine plus a lot of experience in Ecuador. Even though I look young, I graduated very young. In my country, so I have several years of experience. And sometimes I don't care. But sometimes when you're having a bad day, your confidence gets damaged a little bit because of these comments. Sometimes I heard from people in the department or residents saying that, oh, that hospital is not great because there's a lot of IMGs. So my question to you guys, and probably to you, Teofilo, is how to manage that. So also sometimes we have students from all over the world who come here, and they interestingly they come to me, and they ask me, I feel this. I feel as being an IMG, I probably will not be as successful as people who studied here. I'll tell them all the time, look at me. I came being no one, and I'm struggling with visas and green cards and all of that, but it's possible. So how do you manage that, Teofilo? How do you answer that question?
I've experienced that pretty often. That's why I started by saying, where do you go to medical school, as one of the questions. And in many occasions, as I came as a second year, we were like a second group, and as if we would not be able to make it in the application if we were going to apply as a traditional candidate for the first year group. I would say that first of all, even if it doesn't affect you sometimes, as it doesn't affect me, sometimes I think we have to recognize that other people might have tender points around that, and we have to support each other. Then how do you manage? Basically, it is hard because there are differences in our training, and as I said, you feel like you're catching up in many ways. But I think what I would suggest to these people is to keep working hard, to basically recognize the strength that you bring, and just keep getting better and keep fighting. Do not lose your sensitivity, and use those weaknesses that you think they are and turn it into into a strength. For instance, my language, sometimes when I'm communicating with somebody that has a psychiatric problem, they feel vulnerable. They acknowledge that I might be vulnerable too because I have an accent, and I think we level the field, and I think we can connect better. So I think I'm a better psychiatrist because of my vulnerabilities. And I would encourage people to kind of reflect on their own personal experiences and see how they can make it a strength and how they can feel comfortable and look genuine on the way. Do not change your accent. Do not try to dress as an East Coaster. Just go ahead and feel comfortable. And I think people would appreciate when you're genuine and when you incorporate your learning from other non-traditional settings that you've had.
And I'm going to have to bring us to a close. We're about 10 minutes over schedule. Thank you very much. Can we thank the panelists one more time?
While Gary goes back to the podium, I forgot to mention as part of the program that we will be having lunch right outside here. So please stay for lunch.
So I'm back, and I do realize I'm spending between you and lunch, so I'll try to be quick. What Inhinia and Cindy asked me to talk about is, what's the role of the chair of the department in advancing the case for underrepresented medicine for the faculty. So let me begin by saying who I am and why I came to Yale. I'll just answer the question from the audience. So I'm originally from Haiti, and I wanted to know who I really was, so I did 23andMe. And I'm 50% Lebanese and 40% Western African. So my father is of African descent, and we can trace his family back to the War of Independence in Haiti, which happened in the late 1780s, and we became independent in 1804. My mother, parents immigrated from Lebanon, and she was born in Haiti, has never been to Lebanon. So why Yale? Uchina, my parents told me, my father told me that I should come to the US to get educated because you can get the best education in the world. He had been at both in Canada and in Chicago doing his cardiology fellowship. But he said, you have to be careful. It's a very racist country at the time. So I came to NYU undergrad, and then I had applied to med school, and I wanted to make a choice of which med school to go to. So I went to my advisor at certain choices, and he looked at the list I gave him and said, oh, it's very easy. You have to go to Yale. I said, okay. I said, I know about the Yale system, but why do you think I should go to Yale? He said, Yale has the best hospital in the country, the Peter Ben Brigham Hospital. This is where you should go. So that's why I'm here. And I just want you to know that. So what I'm going to try to do in the next 10, 15 minutes is to tell you about the Department of Medicine and also what challenges we're facing and kind of explain why sometimes in times of crisis you can take the opportunity to actually make changes. And this is the story I'm going to tell you. So the department is actually very large. We have close to 700 faculty members, and about 450 are in the ladder track, and the rest are not. We have a very large staff, a very large training program, and I work very closely with Steve for many years on the educational front. And so in total, the department has about 1,000 people, and we are organized in sections. We have 12 sections. And this is where the work gets done. If you look at the faculty, just like psychiatry, you can see that at the assistant professor level, we have about 48% women. But if you look at the professor level, it's 28%. So you can say in terms of women, at the professor level, they are underrepresented. Now, the pipeline for women, though, looks good. So even though at the professor level it's 28%, 48% assistant professor, 45% associate professor, you can see people moving up in the ladder to be professors. Now, if you look at it differently and you look at by race and ethnicity, it looks very different. So at the professor level, 80% are white, 7.3% are Asian, 2% are black or African American, 3%, 2.5% Hispanic or Latino, 0% American Indian, 0.8% Native Hawaiian, and 2 or more races. Now, I have to say that there is the last category of undetermined, so people don't say who they are. So we don't really know, but this is what we're looking at. So all these categories are underrepresented in medicine. So if you look at the general population, they are all under the percentage of people in the general population. What's worse is looking at the pipeline. So let's take just black or African American. There are 4 assistant professors, 3 associate professors, and 2 professors. So it's very hard to see how you're going to bring enough people through the ranks to become professors. So in addition to having a very, very small number, we have a large issue with pipeline. So when I became interim chair of medicine about 4 years ago and permanent chair about 2 years ago, and when I first was appointed interim chair, we had a major issue in the Department of Medicine. And I'm sure all of you know about it. It was about harassment in one of our sections, and it made the national news. And this caused us to actually think and try to figure out who we were and what we were doing and what we stood for. So I thought it was a good opportunity to actually go back and engage the faculty in making sure that we understood our purpose and we understood our mission and we were clear about our values. So this allowed us to engage into discussion as to what our missions were, how we prioritized them, and how we viewed ourselves as a faculty, as a people, and about our cultures and fundamental preferences. So we decided to write out a mission and what I call purpose and value statement. And I'm going to share it with you. And what I'm going to focus on really is the last part of the statement. And this is what the next few slides will be. So, of course, we have a tripartite mission. We do education, clinical care, and research. And we want to do that all well. And we can't prioritize one over the other because they're all highly important to who we are. So this is the first part of the mission statement. Just tells people that's what we'd like to do. So we'd like to advance science and develop new therapies and that are useful for patients. We want to train the next generation of leaders in medicine, and we want to provide the best care that's fair and outstanding for patients. I think what's most important for our conversation today, though, is that we are committed to cultivating an inclusive, collaborative professional culture that respects individual differences, recognizes and rewards diverse talents, and help each person reach their full potential. So if we lived up to that every single day, we can solve the problems we're talking about, pipeline and discrimination and microaggressions. So my job, part of my job in the program leaders is actually to see what systems and structures we can put in place to make that happen. So and Steve actually was part of crafting this mission statement. So our motto, so we like, so what I'd like us to think about in medicine is that we need to be great and nice. So that means everything that we do has to be outstanding, but we have to also be nice to people. And that means patients, staff, faculty member, trainees, your family, and those kind of things. So I like this motto. We just figured this out this morning. I was driving from home and thinking about what I can say about something that's catchy. This is it. This is our new motto. Okay. So I think what we thought we could do is find agents of change and then have some pilots that actually can promote the work that we would like to do. And the first thing we did actually was to look at the leadership in medicine of the sections and programs, and then get a sense of how people felt about them. So we did a 360 evaluation of all the section chiefs and program leaders, and that's about 30 people, and then provided the results to them. We had great engagement of the faculty, about 60 to 70% return rate on the questions, and we engaged a firm to do that. And then we provided leadership opportunities and discussion of how people, leaders were viewed by the people they were leading. And I have to say that was really a very great exercise, because it allowed people to see, to realize how they were being seen by their faculty members and by the staff also. And what we were looking for was for people who were doing a great job, so you can model them, but also people who are having issues, so we can work with them and get better. And I have to say that made a tremendous difference in how they viewed their work and how they improve with some leadership training and some coaching. And that took about a year. Then we wanted to get a better sense of what our culture was. And for that, we engaged a firm from Chicago who met with most of our faculty members in small groups or town halls or focus groups, and through a survey. And the survey they used is something called Gallup 12. So it's only 12 questions, and it's been administered to about 30 million people across the world in different fields. And we did poll in 2 questions. The first was, do you have a good friend at work? And most people felt they did not. So that's a sense of isolation. And the second was, has your immediate supervisor told you were doing a great job in the past 7 days? Now, 7 days is a little short for an academic medical center, but I understand the point that people were didn't feel valued. So we have programs now. We do things now to mitigate the sense of isolation and to actually be more proactive in telling people they're doing a great job. So you guys are a great audience. So one needs agents to actually get things done. So one of the most important committees in medicine, and I think in most departments, is the Appointments and Promotions Committee. And you need somebody who actually understands the importance and does a really great job that understands our culture, what we want to achieve in promotion. And Larry Young is the person who runs this for us, and he's been doing it for several years, and he's really great at it. And we also understand from talking to the faculty that there was a significant need for mentoring. By mentoring, I mean, you can look at mentoring as a Brownian motion. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't, but we wanted to make it much more formalized. And we established a formal program within medicine of assigning mentors, make sure they report, that they meet, and those kind of things. And I think that's well received. One of the problems was that people who were being asked to be mentors didn't quite know how to do it. Sometimes they were really good, sometimes they were not. And fortunately, one of our faculty members, Patrick O'Connor, who was section chief of general medicine, actually has been teaching mentoring for a while. So we engaged him into training many of our mentors to be better mentors, and that's also going well. So far, we've trained 30 people in mentoring. The next agent of change was to appoint Inhenia Chinao, who you met earlier, as the associate chair for diversity and inclusion in the department. So we wanted somebody focused on that work, and Inhenia has been doing a great job. And she also worked with Steve at the graduate medical education. And part of her job was actually pipeline development. So although our medical school class is fairly diverse, diversity decreases significantly when you go to a residency program, fellowship, and then faculty. So most often, we get our faculty from our training program. So if you want to really increase the pipeline, you have to start earlier than that. And Nini has been going out with others in the department to actually tell people that Yale is interested in having you come and taking a look at us. We've developed a visiting clerkship program, and that's been going quite well. We have a lot more work to do, but that's one of the ways we think we can improve the pipeline. And then we also engage other organizations. MORE, which was mentioned before, is the Minority Organization for Retention and Expansion, founded about 10 years ago, that works with faculty primarily, but has links to the to trainees and to medical students. So Peter, for instance, interacts with medical students. Now, so we've been doing this for the past 3 years. So what results have we achieved? So I'm going to give you 2 examples. The first is the pulmonary critical care and sleep medicine section, and Peter is a member of that section, and Herb Knight, who asked the question, is also a member of the section. And we had a new section chief, Naftali Kaminsky, and I want to show you what he's been able to achieve in recruitment of faculty member and how the composition of the faculty has changed because he's interested and engaged in the work. So this is a picture of the pulmonary critical care sleep medicine program, and you can see the people there. Naftali is in the middle, here. And Peter, is that you, Peter? That's you, okay. So if you look at the composition of the faculty, you can see that from 2011 to 2017, it's gone from 20%, and this is, so 20% underrepresented and women to about 53%. And this is a proactive way of recruiting people and recruiting both women and underrepresented medicine. Now, very often people will say, well, if you do that, you are trading excellence for diversity. So that's something you'll hear quite often. So in this particular case, you can see that over time, and we'll just look at the number of papers of the section as a proxy for quality. You can see that over time, it's gone really high. So in addition to diversifying the faculty, the output, academic output, and quality of the work they're doing has increased significantly. So you can do both. Now, to increase the sense of belonging and not feeling too isolated, we have a newsletter that we started to send every month. And we just hired a communication director called Julie Perry, who's been working on that with us. And I also now have a Twitter account. I can send things out. I was sending some tweets earlier this morning. And so we highlight our faculty member, what they've done, committees, their own papers they've published. And I have something that I say every now and then. So for this particular one, I said, did you know that over the past 4 years, 55% of faculty appointed or promoted to the rank of professor were women or underrepresented medicine? For the previous 4 years, it was 19%. So over the past 4 years, we increased it by almost twofold. Now, so in addition to the work in just the Department of Medicine, through MORE, we've been engaged in trying to get to enlarging the community. So we host a reception at our house every year. It's been going on for many years. And this year we had 250 people. So I want to show you a few pictures of the people who attend the reception, and Rick usually attends, and I'm very happy to see him at the reception, but also here. So, and the purpose of the reception actually to get a sense that there's a larger professional community in New Haven. So we invite nurses, we invite people from folks from the hospital. Michael Holmes comes quite often. We invite medical students, trainees, community physicians, lawyers who come and visit and with us sometimes. So, and it's a time for people to get to know each other, make some connections. And I'm just going to show you a few pictures. So, so this is Rick Bibiscus, thinking very deeply. We invite the mayor, she sometimes comes. And then we take a group picture. So this is one of the pictures this year of all the people who came, and there are children, students, Jim Comer is here. So in a way, that's one of the things that we do to increase the sense of belonging and connections and make you feel a bit more comfortable here at Yale. So, and then I showed you the data on the section of pulmonary critical care and sleep medicine. I wanted to show you some data on the department as a whole, as we are doing this work in increasing diversity and inclusion. Are we compromising quality? So these data are something called Blue Ridge NIH ranking, and the ranking is only based on the amount of NIH funding that you get every single year. So you can rank all the medical schools in the country. Here I'm showing you data from Yale School of Medicine, where they rank the basic science departments and the clinical departments. And you can see that medicine is here. So we have this particular year, this was 2017, we had a total NIH budget of $105 million, and we ranked number 9 in the country. Psychiatry had a budget of $72 million, and we ranked number 1 in the country. We compare favorably to all the basic science sections. And if you look at medicine over many years, you can see that as there are two things happening. So this is income, yearly income, and this is ranking in NIH funding. There are two things happening in medicine. One, we have increased our clinical programs a lot. And there is always a worry that as you're doing that, you are ignoring the academic mission. And two, we've been trying to diversify our faculty. So if you look over the years, from 2010 to 2018, clinical income has increased significantly, NIH income has increased significantly from 2014 on, and our ranking has gotten better. So we used to be ranked in the top 15, now we're ranking in the top 10, and I'm very sure that this year we'll rank in the top 5. So the message here is that you can do both at the same time. We recently had a retreat to figure out what we want to do this year, what the major projects are, and I'm just going to show you things we're going to be doing about culture and faculty well-being. So we have certain general principles that we focus on. We want to make sure that our faculty understand the purpose of why they're here, not just what they're doing, and that we develop a sense of belonging. And we work on work-life efficiency and work-life balance and workplace efficiency. And those are things that we keep in mind as we're developing pilots and projects. And the specific things we're going to be doing is we've expanded our new faculty orientation from none to 2 days. We actually get a sense of what the place is like and who you can talk, who you can contact if you have issues or questions. And we are continuing our mentoring program, and Inhinia is continuing to work on the pipeline issue. I believe that in medicine, we all work in teams. There is no one who works by themselves. And it turns out that if you work in a team, and based on our own data, if you work on a team that's not functioning very well, the chances of you being burned out is very high. So we believe that one way to look at this from a systems point of view, we want to build better teams. So we have a program that's currently ongoing where we engage all our section chiefs and certain program leaders in learning about team leadership and how you develop teams and make them more efficient and more highly functional. And this is a 5-week training program, 3 hours each week. And we'll see whether that helps or not. And then finally, we're working on certain things to make life easier, particularly for people who do clinical work both in the inpatient and outpatient. So I'm going to stop here, and this is just a brief overview of the way we think about diversity and inclusion in medicine, some of the things we've done, all these things we're just trying them out. We're not sure they will work well. We have some idea that some of it is working, but we believe that this is a long-term process. It's something that you have to keep at, requires a lot of energy, and requires the help of everyone. So thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yes, Susan.
So this question is actually for the panel as well, so don't run away, please answer if you can. But in the context of the mentorship program, which I'm also involved with Patrick, yesterday we were meeting and a question came up in one of the cases. We were actually discussing inclusion and diversity. That was the topic yesterday. And one of the cases that we discussed was of a faculty member who was mentoring another faculty, a junior faculty member who had been the only woman of color in that institution. The question was, should the mentor specifically ask about how that experience might be impacting, how being underrepresented might be impacting her experience, and directly ask that question. And among the group of maybe 12 people that were there was a lot of heated debate and argument as to whether that would be helpful for that person or if it would actually kind of highlight that sense of being other to have that question be asked directly. So this question had come up last year as well and had been discussed in detail, and one of the members of the class had brought it up to a historian who talked about this, and that person had suggested that it actually would be helpful if asked in a sensitive way. But again, in that environment, there was also disagreement about it. So my question, actually, I see Dr. Johnson. She was in that class last night. My question is, I'd love to hear in this forum your response to whether that would be welcomed or actually challenging.
Okay, our panel is still here.
We have one
I
last
think
question.
we'll take one more question and then for closing remarks by Michelle.
This is a question to Dr. Desir about the 50% Lebanese.
Yes.
In your
I know you'd be interested in that.
I'm Lebanese, in case. 100%, actually. I did the 23andMe, I was 100% Lebanese. No, the question is because, it came up a lot from the resident in neurology. Theo mentioned something, and myself being an immigrant, when you have an accent and you go to a patient's room or you are discussing a great idea in a meeting, you feel a little bit dismissed or people question where are you from, etc. So the question I have for you is, how are we going to make sure by putting some emphasis on the underrepresented minority that we're not neglecting a certain group of faculty, student, resident who might feel they are minority, however, they don't fit in any of the criteria. I always, when I have to check your racial background, now they put Middle Eastern, that it is white, but I always struggle with this one because am I really white? Yeah. Because I'm not treating like a white person. So what do you have in mind about this particular group of, faculty, trainee, students who don't fit in any group, especially with the climate in Washington and how the nation is going? What's your reflection about that? Thank you.
I mean, that's a really great question. I don't have an answer that I know is right. I mean, I can tell you how I think about it. I think I view, let's say, the Department of Medicine as one team, and that we have diverse skills and talents, and that we have a purpose and a goal. And my job is to leverage our collective talent to achieve the best results we can get. And I view, and that we in medicine want to develop an environment that allows every single person, whatever your problem, your issues might be, to be the best you can be. So I welcome everybody, and there are people who need different help, but our goal is to try to help everyone reach their full potential. It might be, pie in the sky, but that's how we're approaching it.
And there's also a literature that talks about minoritized individuals, so even if you're not in underrepresented exactly in terms of numbers, your experiences still mirrors folks who are underrepresented, and I think that that's one of the reasons why we decided to expand the panel and to hear from multiple voices, even if the numbers per se, but the experiences were similar.
So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to have Michelle Johnson, who, as I mentioned before, is the first African-American woman promoted to professor at Yale in the School of Medicine. She's going to have short closing comments so we can go to lunch. Michelle, welcome.
So thank you very much, and thank you for those who stayed. It was an amazing program from my point of view. What I'd like is a show of hands for a question. Did anything that the panelists, Dr. Desir, Dr. Lattimore, say today resonate with you, even in a tiny way, whether it was on rounds with the patient, whether it was in your car talking to your headliner, whether it was speaking to your children? Could you, with us hands up in the air, is there anybody who was touched by anything today? So almost everybody has their hands up. And I think that sends a message to this group, the organizers and the people here and the people who had to go back to work so we could be here for lunch, that it's not just about underrepresentation, but it is about it. It's about all of us being a part of a community that's important. The people on the panel are exceptional, but they're not exceptions. And everyone, we could make panels of 5 of you in any of this room in any combination and come up with compelling stories that will serve to make us more cohesive and make us more collaborative. So I appreciate having the opportunity to make the closing comments. I think the closing comments were really to applaud the audience as well as our faculty and to say thank you for sharing your stories, your comments, and your questions. Thanks very much.